used and some others have used as well. That seems to be the end state that we were really focused on here. I think some of the indications are certainly, I think everybody's looking at the Maxar images that are on television now, but there's a lot more being, I think, collected here through a variety of intelligence, means, whether it's SIGINT or MASINT or HUMINT or whatever else it is, that will help us form a bigger picture. But of course, it's ultimately we're going to need to have something that tells us what actually happened down inside those tunnels and those things that the bombs went down. So I think that's something we're still really paying attention to. I think the chairman was pretty measured in this, and I think that's important to be that way because we could be surprised at the end of this, find out that maybe we didn't have the effects that we had hoped for. I think the second thing here on uncertainty is how is Iran going to respond? There's been some strikes into Israel, but not much more. Certainly nothing directed at us. Do they have a surprise for us? Have they held something in reserve that we're going to see revealed here? They certainly have capabilities, but they have been degraded significantly. That may impact the delivery of this, but nonetheless, I think that's something else. I think that's injecting some certainty. And then, of course, how are we going to respond to that? If it's kind of a tepid response, will we be going back in? Or if it's more effective, then I think we can count on the fact the United States will respond to that. And then, how does all this conclude? Thinking through what the next steps are for the United States, I think are really, really critical. And how does that impact our strategy for the Middle East going forward? And what does Iran look like going forward? And certainly, there's a lot of discussions about that this morning, and most of the media here in terms of what comes behind the current supreme leader. Is it another supreme leader? Is it something else? But I guess my point here is that sometimes we have a tendency to think that a military solution can insert some certainty into a situation. But I think what we're seeing here is that there still is a significant amount of uncertainty about what is going to take place here, even with a very well executed operation. I think the third thing, and I'll just very briefly comment on this, is that I think one of the things I'm trying to pay attention to, and hopefully we'll begin to see more and more indications of it, but how does the region respond to this? There have been some very significant changes just in the last 8 or 9 days with kind of the further reduction of the Iranian military, the threat that they once posed to the region. How do regional actors respond to this, both from a security standpoint and really from a diplomatic standpoint? And I think this is something I think worth paying attention to. Will partners move quickly to reinforce their own defense in this case? Will they see this as a dividend? How will this impact future relations between the Gulf countries and Israel? These are all things that I think we're going to have to think our way through, but certainly things that I'm beginning to pay attention to. So, Ken, maybe I'll stop right there and look forward to our questions.
Fantastic. And that's a great segue into the next speaker. Although, Dan, before I bring you in, I have to confess, I have already failed as a moderator this morning because, of course, I forgot to point out to the audience that if you'd like to ask a question, please do so through the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. And if you're not familiar with that, go to the bottom of your Zoom screen. You'll find a Q&A button there, right between the green share button and the show captions button. If you click on that, it will bring up a dialog box. You can type your question in, and I will ask the questions as we move along. So apologies both to the speakers and the audience for my failure. I confess it's a Monday morning, and I've had a long weekend already. But Dan, the general set you up perfectly. What are you thinking about? Talk to us about what's on your minds.
Sure. Thanks, General, and thanks, Ken. A few thoughts from me. First, it seems like a moment for humility. I mean, for decades, we've been speculating about what would happen at exactly this moment if we had U.S. military strikes on Iran. But it strikes me that there's so much more that we don't know than what we do know, including the very basics of the battlefield damage assessment. It seems to me that despite some triumphalism, there's no once and for all solution here to the Iranian nuclear program, and we shouldn't expect one-off airstrikes to eliminate the Iranian nuclear threat. And you're already seeing questions about the stockpiles and the risk of rebuilding. I think in the immediate term, we're in a very fraught window. We don't know how contained the ladder of escalation will be, what Iran's next turn is, what our turn is after that. It's been pointed out that none of Iran's options are great. I think that's true. I think Iraq is a place where we may well see Iranian retaliation, and my thoughts are certainly with Americans who are serving overseas in the region, who are really on the front lines of a heightened risk of retaliation. One notable factor about the retaliation is that Iran is conducting it under Israeli bombardment. Iranian leadership is in hiding and apparently unreachable, which I think is going to complicate both Iranian command and control and retaliation and potential efforts to search for off-ramps and de-escalation. Second, just a few thoughts about what this looks like from our Gulf counterparts. I mean, it's hard to believe, but it was like 6 weeks ago that President Trump was actually in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha on a trip that was touting the economic model and safety and security of the Gulf region and promoting a slew of business deals. And on that trip, Gulf leaders reportedly told President Trump that they don't want a war. They feared being exposed on the front lines of maximum pressure as they felt they were in 2019 when Saudi oil installations were struck without retaliation. Now, I think, of course, there's a sense of quiet satisfaction about seeing Iran laid low after so many years of threats and so much bullying. How could there not be? But there's also a deep apprehension about what comes next. This is not a war that Gulf states really wanted. Since 2019, they created a significant investment in a deep sense of détente with Iran. The threat perception didn't change, but the tactics sure did. And I would say to a surprising extent, the Gulf shielded itself from the conflicts that we've seen since October 7th, 2023. And we'll have to see if that détente survives, I think, the next period. It's striking that the defense minister and brother of the crown prince was in Tehran 2 months ago, but I think now we're in a new moment. The admonition that I kept hearing from Gulf partners over the last several years is that if you're going to stir a hornet's nest, you have to act decisively. I think Gulf countries are exposed. They can't counterpunch in the same way that the United States can. They've positioned themselves differently. They've put out MFA statements, bending over backward to stay out of the line of fire with Iran. They probably appreciated how much U.S. strikes were advertised as coming from the U.S. homeland and submarines and not from the Gulf. They've been actively trying to de-escalate, including at the moment when the strikes landed, and I think you can expect them to keep doing that. As a colleague of mine says, the G3, Saudi, Qatar, UAE, I think are probably closer to this White House in some cases than the E3 of England, France, and Germany. And I suspect that Gulf states have been privately messaging Moscow to quietly tell the Iranians to take this deal. The last thought is that I think we're going to need to find a way to marry up the military with the diplomatic and larger strategy at some point. Israel has accomplished a huge amount militarily. It sure seems like we accomplished something significant too, although we'll find out exactly what. Step one is to manage retaliation from Iran, but then I think step two is going to be to figure out how to convert something military and quite successful into something that's much more durable. Diplomacy with Iran is hard under the best of circumstances and maybe impossible under these. But the next steps when it comes to things like disposing of stockpiles and monitoring, there's a certain amount you can do with military and intelligence, but some of it is probably going to come down to diplomacy. Now, Iran, for its part, knows that nobody is eager to come in on the ground, and it may well seek to weather this storm and claim victory just by surviving the air campaign. They're badly weakened by a series of missteps since October 7th, but I think the regime still gets a vote in what happens next, and if they double down on defiance, then what I think we hope is a one-off could well turn out to be a more sustained conflict. With that, let me pass it back.
That's a great set of comments initially, Dan. Thank you for that. Colby, we got a bunch of people in our audience who are very interested in the energy markets. Take us through your area of expertise, please.
Sure. Thanks, Ken. So, the update since the events of the weekend is, the general statement is something that nobody will be surprised to hear, which is that these developments point towards greater risks and not fewer. This brings us closer to the possibility of a disruption in the flow of oil and gas supplies from the Gulf. seeing things this morning like the shelter-in-place order for U.S. citizens in Qatar, Japanese banks considering pulling staff from the region. The market did react accordingly when oil began trading again last night. Brent crude spiked above $80 per barrel, as would be expected in a situation like this. But as we were getting started with this session, it had receded a bit, and it was trading at a lower level than it closed out last week. These new developments tend to cause a spike. The risk sort of gets baked in as things move along, and as we don't have more developments, and that's something that we're going to continue to see until there's more certainty on where things go. But we were in the low 60s when these tensions started to rise. The geopolitical risk premium has put us in the mid $70 per barrel range, and I think until we get to a point where things start to simmer down a bit, and who can say when that will be, this is where we'll be. But it's important to point out that this is the market pricing in the potential for a disruption. It's not in reaction to any actual loss of supply, which to date we haven't seen. There are impacts that are beginning to be felt elsewhere in the world, and the macroeconomic outlook will feel that the longer this goes on, even if there is no actual loss of supply. So, a couple examples of that. Some of my colleagues at Energy Intelligence were reporting later last week that jet fuel prices are up worldwide. That's a knockoff impact from the fact that Europe now sources about 60% of its jet fuel imports from areas within the Strait. That's a result of them moving away from Russian imports in 2022 after the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war. The startup of the Al Zour refinery in Kuwait, which is around a 615,000 barrel per day facility, has been a major supplier of refined products to Europe since that took place. Freight rates for VLCCs, or very large crude carriers, have started to spike. Rates from the Gulf to China are up over 60% since the conflict began. And these are things that you're going to see continue to happen the longer the conflict takes place. I think if it gets to a point where we're sustained at a certain level of hostility without, imminent signs of escalation, you'll see things sort of playing out a bit. But as these risks get kind of baked in, we're not going to be sitting in this lower price environment that we were in, and really kind of the post-Liberation Day environment when crude started to crash a bit. Another point that I'll come to is that a lot of the coverage of the energy issues surrounding the war so far have really been focused on issues within the Strait of Hormuz, and that matters, but so does the bigger picture. I think it's possible that we are a little bit too focused on what could go wrong in the Strait here, and I do acknowledge that it is a bit ironic for me to say that with a map of the Strait hanging behind my head, but I think the bigger picture could get a bit lost in that and sort of blind us to some of the other potential risks that we have. The webinar that MEI had yesterday, Alex Vatanka very rightly pointed out that the Strait has never been shut, and the region hasn't experienced that before. But what the Gulf has seen is a tanker war in the 1980s. It saw targeted attacks like that take place in 2019. It saw a major attack on critical oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. None of these things are without precedent, and I don't want to suggest that they're imminent, but I think the possibility of getting too focused on the absolute worst case scenario in the Strait could blind us, like I said a second ago, to some of these other things that will potentially drive up prices, drive up costs of things like insurance and shipping for tankers, and again, we'll have that ripple effect on the global economy. That's the type of thing that we could see sustained depending on the direction this goes in. There's been a lot of suggestion as well that this isn't something that is incredibly likely, and that's generally attributed to economic interdependence. which I don't want to suggest doesn't matter. It absolutely does, with things like Iranian oil flows to China. But I think if the 2020s have taught us anything so far, it's that economic ties don't always prevent conflict. Russia was incredibly reliant on European markets for its oil and gas exports. That didn't stop them from invading Ukraine and doubling down. Western oil majors pulling out of Russia, which are a very important part of the Russian energy sector, didn't really seem to have a major impact on Moscow's calculus in that regard. And Iran is even less integrated with the global economy than Russia was when the war took place. So I think in that regard, Tehran is also going to be aware of some of the pressure points for this administration. The president was, in the run-up to this conflict, voicing discontent with rising oil prices. That's clearly a key issue that they do not want to see sustained as things go on. So I think that probably factors into Iran's calculus somewhere. I'm hesitant to think that the whatever kind of strategic decision making is taking place in Iran is really going to hinge on what about what happens to the Chinese teapot refiners. I think that's it's an important part of their ability to continue getting revenue and continue funding their operations. But in a moment of existential threats, if that's the way the thinking is going, it's hard to say that that's something that's going to tip the balance. Coming back to some of the other risks, though, there are bottlenecks elsewhere in the Gulf. There are infrastructure choke points. Roughly 70 to 75% of liquids that come out of the Gulf, and by that I mean crude, condensate, and refined products, flow through about 9 facilities, and that includes Kharg Island in Iran. There are a lot of other terminals in the Gulf, but these are the high volume export terminals that are really, I think, represent some of the very critical bottlenecks that could emerge if there were to be a disruption at any of them, and this would really amplify the price impact without any activity taking place in the strait, and depending on a big picture situation, this is something that could even last longer. Now, the difference between that and a closure of the strait is, of course, that the OPEC producers in the region could, in theory, tap some of their spare capacity to make up for that lost supply. So the risk is slightly lower in that regard. But I think, again, getting a little bit too focused on the strait is something that could potentially catch us off guard if there is something like that were to take place. I think that is where a bit of the good news comes in, though, because for now it does seem that the targeting of different energy facilities that we saw right at the beginning of the conflict in the first couple of days does seem to have eased a bit. With South Pars in Iran and the Haifa refinery in Israel being targeted. That does not seem to have continued to the same extent. So it fortunately does not seem like we're in this kind of escalatory cycle of tit for tat attacks on energy infrastructure. That said, I'm aware that there were a couple different incidents in both Iran and Israel that took place that led to some power outages that were fairly brief. Excuse me. So we shouldn't assume that this won't flare up again under the right, or I guess I should say wrong conditions. But some of that has subsided, and I think you've seen the impact of that begin to ease a bit. Israel has restarted pipeline gas exports to Egypt and Jordan, so hopefully that does ease up the pressure on countries that are very dependent on this for the time being. But it's something that we still need to have on the radar. So I conclude by saying that we're seemingly away from this kind of escalatory ladder where each step relative to the energy space could bring us closer and closer to catastrophe. But the overall escalation in the conflict is something that is going to keep those risks in the foreground, both in the Strait and elsewhere. And that's what I think should be on everybody's radar for the time being.
It's terrific, Colby. Okay, that's a great start from all three of you. Jill, I need to start with you in terms of the questions because we've just got a ton of questions, entirely understandable, regarding responses. So here's the way I'd like to put this to you to try to group them all together. Put yourself back in your old shoes, your old stomping ground. So once again, you're the commander of CENTCOM down in Tampa. As you're looking at the region in the aftermath of these strikes, what are the greatest concerns that you will have, right? What are the real, we know about the whole range of threats, Iran's proxies and allies, its missile forces, its anti-shipping capabilities in the Gulf and around the Strait. What are your greatest concerns, right? What would you, at this moment in time, if you were back in Tampa, what would you be paying most attention to you? What would you be most concerned about? And then if you can, if you want to take us to two, three, four of what your biggest concerns would be, what would your recommendation back to Washington be for how we handle them? So if Iran does this, here's my recommendation of how we handle it.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a great question, Ken. I mean, I think the thing I would certainly be thinking about here in the wake of our strike, and kind of again presuming that this was that our policy was to go in and do this strike and then use that as a mechanism to bring Iran back to the table. So there's really no immediate planned military follow-up to that. I think the thing I'm most concerned about is making sure that we have looked at everything, at all of our vulnerabilities, and to an Iranian response. I mean, we have certainly seen ballistic missiles launch back and forth. That's certainly a big concern. But I'm equally concerned about the remnants of proxy organizations. I'm equally concerned about drones that can get in. I mean, think about what happened at Tower 22. A relatively simple attack that can cause strategic implications here. So I'm really focused on trying to address those things and make sure that we have absolutely minimized the risk wherever we can, taking the appropriate measures we can to make sure we're prepared for it, and we're doing everything we can to keep a good eye for it. I think the second thing I'm thinking about is the potential for a response if something does happen. General Kurilla, the CENTCOM commander, still has resources at his disposal, so he will have to very quickly come up with options to respond to this. And in the event that there is some type of Iranian reaction that causes damage or, God forbid, causes casualties, I think we should expect there will be a response. And so I would definitely be working with the staff on an array of responses that we could provide that that are kind of related to the type of attack that we may absorb. So in order to give the president and Secretary of Defense the most amount of options here with all of that. In terms of the last part of your question there, in terms of what I would advise, I think it kind of goes back to maybe a little bit of what I said before. I do think disciplined communications is really, really important here. If we're really trying to get Iran to come back to the table here, our communications, our actions, our words should really be focused on that. We shouldn't be tempting fate by throwing other ideas out there about regime change or other things like that. I don't think that's helpful to the security situation, and I think it complicates it, frankly. So I think we have to exercise some discipline in terms of our messaging, our strategic messaging, our policy messaging about where we are. Either we're if we're really focused on the nuclear weapons program and eliminating that and getting back to the table to do that, then that ought to be the focus of what we're doing here. I think this ambiguity that comes with throwing a whole bunch of things around is not good for the overall security situation. I think we just have to be more disciplined in terms of doing that. And I would be using my influence as the CENTCOM commander to try to I think to try to emphasize that point.
That's terrific. Okay, one for Dan. Really interesting question. So, you've talked a little bit about how the Gulf is responding to this, but could you unpack a little bit how the Gulf is thinking about Israel in light of this war? In what ways has it changed Gulf perceptions of Israel? This is obviously a very big deal, and my own sense is that the Gulf response is somewhat mixed. So take us through what you're hearing, Dan, from the Gulf states in terms of, and your own, if you're not hearing anything, or if they're keeping it quiet themselves, how you expect they will respond to Israel after this, how it may change Israeli relations with the Gulf.
No, it's a great question, and I think it probably happens in different phases at different times. Right now, we're in a window of really acute risk, uh, where the risk that this splashes across the water onto them is meaningful. I think they're somewhat more confident than they were in the past that they've taken steps to prevent that, but it's real. It wasn't long ago that the phrase "Little Sparta" was used by a former CENTCOM commander to refer to the UAE. I think the Gulf states are out of the Sparta business, and the undisputed Sparta of the Middle East these days is Israel, backed by the United States. And that kind of military dominance and I would say a willingness to use military force to change the equation on the ground is quite potent. It isn't what they chose. It wasn't the course of action that they were looking for at this moment when they were focused on economic modernization and détente with Iran. Um, I think that for different Gulf states will have different reactions. And by and large, efforts to weaken Iran, I would say, ultimately are favored by the Gulf states, although I would say that they have to deal with what's left. And it's striking that the Iranian capabilities and threats and proxies that are the least diminished by the last 20 months are those that are the closest to the Gulf, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, and short-range missiles as well. So they're still under a lot of threat. I think when it comes to Israel, the countries that have built relations with Israel probably take some comfort in the fact that they have a strong horse on their side. I think the countries that have staked more on de-escalation and diplomacy, like Oman and Kuwait, are probably, and less on relations with Israel, are more apprehensive about a region where Israel takes more strategic initiative and calls more of the shots. Um, but I think just about everywhere there's a real mix. I don't think anyone likes the kind of imperialism and aggression and bullying that Gulf states have been subjected to over the last several decades by Iran. And there is some satisfaction in that. But I think beneath that, there's a deep unease because they were pursuing a different strategy that I think had paid some dividends for the states involved. And I think that strategy may run aground on some of the contradictions of this moment when it comes to the approaches that other states are pursuing vis-a-vis Iran.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, one for Colby. Um, Colby, obviously, everyone is focused now on the Strait and the potential for disruptions there, right? That is obvious. But there have also been some changes, disruptions, if you want to put it that way, with regard to hydrocarbons in the Eastern Med, right? So on the other side of the Middle East, Israel shutting much of its gas production, halting gas exports to Egypt. Should the stuff that's going on in the Eastern Med on the western side of the Middle East, is that something that we should be thinking more about? Is that meaningful in your from your perspective? You're muted, Colby.
Sorry to think after all these years,